The desert heat clung to everything at the forward operating base, making the metal skin of aircraft shimmer in the late light. The turbines roared at the far end of the tarmac, steady as the breath of the base itself, while rotors from a waiting helicopter beat hot air down the rows of tents. Dust rose and hung in a thin veil that blurred the outlines of the concrete walls and the skeleton towers. In the noise and restlessness of men and machines, the pilots of the strike wing laughed and cursed, tossing helmets from one to another, voices bouncing hard against the corrugated walls of the ready room. Their noise filled every gap, leaving no space for reflection. Morgan Hale sat apart, quiet. Her head bent slightly as she smoothed the corner of a laminated checklist. The pages had been handled so many times that the edges curled inward, but she pressed them flat again before folding the sheet into a perfect rectangle and sliding it into the sleeve pocket of her flight suit. It was a habit she had never abandoned, even when others teased her for still carrying paper in a cockpit built on glass screens. She did not argue with them. Silence, for her, had always been stronger than any comeback. The heat pressed harder as the squadron sergeant read the roster. A black marker scrawl caught the light on the whiteboard. The words, "Last in," scrawled next to her name. Someone had added it as a joke, a small reminder of her reputation for caution, for being slower to commit, slower to break formation. The men chuckled, one elbow nudging Brendan, who carried his swagger as naturally as his helmet. He grinned at her and called across the room that he hoped she would not hold them up tonight. His voice carried easily over the turbine hum, sharp and mocking, and the others laughed with him. Morgan gave no answer. She pressed her gloves tighter into her helmet bag and rose, her movements measured. Each step to the line was steady, her boots striking against the floor with the same rhythm she carried into the air. No matter how loud the others grew, her pace never altered. Outside, the sun slid lower, bleeding red and gold across the sand haze. The noise swallowed every corner of the flight line, yet in her breathing she found a pocket of quiet that nothing could shake. On the tarmac, the jets gleamed, noses pointed like drawn blades. Technicians moved quickly around them, guiding fuel lines, checking panels, barking updates above the turbine roar. Morgan walked through them with the laminated checklist still heavy in her sleeve, her hand brushing the edge as if to confirm it was in place. Each motion was deliberate, each pause purposeful, as though she carried her own stillness into the storm of sound and heat. Brendan's voice followed her again, needling about her flying high, playing safe, letting others do the work. She did not even glance back. Instead, she climbed the ladder into her cockpit and sat with quiet precision, tightening harness straps, adjusting her helmet, fingers grazing every switch with care. Her silence was not surrender. It was a shield, and every pilot who had mocked her knew, deep inside, that silence could not be shaken once it settled. As the turbine screamed louder, her thoughts steadied. The oil-smudged roster with its cheap joke meant nothing. The noise of the ready room would fade. What remained was her checklist, folded with care, proof that preparation mattered more than bravado. Respect would never be granted in a laugh or a careless word. It would be carved quietly in the way she breathed, the way she prepared, and in the way she flew when the noise of others had finally burned itself away. The six-ship formation slipped into the evening haze above the desert, their shadows crossing in long streaks over the ridgelines. The convoy below stretched like a narrow thread through the pass known on maps as Narrow 7, trucks crawling between cliffs that rose jagged and sharp. Over the radios, the voices of the other pilots filled the air, easy with confidence, trading jokes as though this were routine and unworthy of tension. Brendan laughed first, pointing out that the dust trail of the convoy looked like a line of ants in the sand. The others joined in, their voices mixing with the hiss of static until it sounded more like a bar room than a mission net. Morgan Hale listened but did not speak. She had taken a higher perch, altitude giving her a wider view and more margin for fuel. Her engines droned steady, the canopy reflecting pale light as the desert floor shimmered far below. She studied the thermal overlay on her HUD, eyes tracing across the terrain where heat signatures pulsed faintly against the cooler rock. One return caught her attention, a bloom tucked beneath a ridge, too concentrated to be explained by stone. Her gloved hand reached for the small notepad clipped inside the cockpit, and she wrote the coordinates before folding the page carefully and tucking it beside her seat. No announcement, no interruption of the chatter that still carried on. The others had already begun timing fuel. One pilot mentioned he would call for an early return once his bingo marker hit, and laughter followed as they traded barbs about who would buy the first round when they got back. Their confidence wrapped them like armor, and yet none of them saw what Morgan saw. She looked again at the flickering overlay, the irregular pulse steadying her suspicion. She shifted slightly in her seat, her breathing even, her hand brushing the folded note as though to anchor her certainty. The convoy drivers checked in, their voices edged with strain as engines labored through the pass. Dust rose in sheets behind them, a faint curtain against the horizon. Morgan keyed her mic only once to confirm altitude, her tone flat, unremarkable. She gave no hint of the anomaly she logged. The others would not listen now. They had already built their world of jokes and timing, their assumption that nothing of consequence waited here. Above them, the sky darkened toward dusk, the sun dropping lower, shadows lengthening along the canyon walls. Morgan's HUD flickered once, a quick static pulse before clearing. The system strained by heat. She tapped the side of the display but did not lose focus. In the silence of her own cockpit, she listened to the rhythm of her breathing, steady and calm, the sound a counterpoint to the radio's constant laughter. She traced the terrain lines again, cross-checking against her memory of past maps. That heat bloom did not belong. She logged it once more, folding the paper tighter and pressing it flat, making sure it would not drift free. The symbolic weight of that folded note meant more than any call sign recognition or casual joke. It was her proof, kept silent until the time demanded it. When Brendan announced he was considering an early exit, claiming fuel would not stretch if the convoy dragged its pace, the formation broke into more laughter. None of them realized that the ridge ahead concealed more than stone. Morgan's silence held steady. In the balance between noise and vigilance, she already knew which side carried weight. The first rocket-propelled grenade streaked down from the ridgeline just as the lead vehicle cleared the tightest bend of the pass. The blast tore through steel and sandbags, sending a bloom of fire into the air that echoed hard between the cliffs. The truck lurched sideways, black smoke curling skyward, and the convoy behind it braked in panicked succession. Almost at once the cliffs erupted with muzzle flashes, machine gun fire stitching the length of the canyon. The air filled with echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once, each burst magnified by stone until it sounded like the desert itself was cracking open. Morgan Hale's HUD flickered, the icons of convoy vehicles flaring with distress beacons. Her fuel gauge glowed yellow, warning that every additional minute cut into her return margin. She steadied her breathing, gripping the throttle with her left hand, her right brushing the stick with calm precision. Below, frantic voices crowded the radio, drivers shouting coordinates, medics calling for cover, a platoon leader trying to establish control through static. The rhythm of panic filled the airwaves until it was nearly impossible to separate order from chaos. The other pilots broke first. Brendan's voice came sharp, claiming bingo fuel, demanding clearance to peel. Another followed, citing the same. Within moments, 2 jets rolled away from formation, their contrails cutting white scars against the dusk. Their absence left a heavier silence than Morgan expected. The laughter of earlier gone, replaced by clipped calls of departure. Command responded coldly, logging acknowledgments and redirecting attention to fuel conservation. The message carried an undertone that Morgan should follow. On a second channel, the Apache crews checked in, their voices edged with frustration. They were already low on fuel, barely enough to cover extraction. One admitted he had no choice but to pull back before being stranded. Their rotor beats faded quickly. a low thrum diminishing into nothing. In minutes, the convoy was stripped of its cover, the ridgelines alive with hostile fire, the canyon itself a cage. Morgan did not move. She circled higher, eyes locked on the burning wreck at the front of the column. Flames spat through the torn chassis, black smoke trailing upward, a beacon of vulnerability visible for miles. Her HUD kept blinking, fuel margins slipping closer to red, but she steadied her gaze. The throttle stayed gripped in silence, her hand calm where others had let panic push them home. Command broke through the chaos with a clipped directive. Return to base immediately. Her call sign repeated, the words stripped of warmth. She pressed her mic button, hesitated, then released it without a word. Her silence was her answer. She banked, setting her arc to keep the ridges in view, watching the convoys scramble for cover. The echoes of gunfire shook through her helmet, the sound vibrating in her chest. Yet she remained steady, one figure holding line where all else fractured. The pass filled with smoke and screaming engines as trucks lurched to reverse, some colliding in their attempt to escape. The canyon mouth remained sealed by fire. Panic had unseated every rhythm below, yet in her cockpit, Morgan's breathing never wavered. She watched, measured, prepared. In the moment of greatest abandonment, the truth stood plain. The others had left. The Apaches had withdrawn. Command had chosen procedure. What remained was one jet circling, fuel fading, checklist folded in her sleeve, and the calm certainty that the storm demanded her silence to anchor it. Morgan Hale waited for the firing pattern to settle. The ridgeline guns barked in bursts, their rhythm too steady to be random. She marked the crest of muzzle flashes, tracing the seconds between volleys, her breathing aligned with each pause. When the moment opened, she dropped her nose and pressed the trigger. The Ju-8 cannon roared, the sound more like tearing sky than weapon fire. Brass casings tumbled in streams from beneath her wings, glinting in the last rays of dusk, before vanishing into the dust clouds. The first burst shredded rock and flesh alike, silencing the gun that had pinned the convoy's lead element. Below, soldiers rallied in the brief stillness, voices cutting through static with a surge of hope. Engines revved again as trucks pushed forward, their drivers emboldened by the sudden gap in enemy fire. Morgan climbed back into her circle, HUD lights flashing warnings of fuel already too low, but her hands never wavered. Her gloves pressed steady against throttle and stick, her body one with the rhythm of aircraft and cannon. Another ridge lit up, tracers curving downward. She adjusted angles, lining the trajectory with cold precision. Her second pass came lower, dust boiling around her fuselage as cannon rounds tore through the emplacements. Stones collapsed in showers, and silence followed in the gaps where fire had rained moments before. Each strike was measured, never wasted, each burst timed with a surgeon's control. Her cockpit glowed with warning lights, amber bleeding toward red. Return messages from command scrolled across her screen, but she ignored them, eyes fixed on the convoy's survival. She inhaled, exhaled, pressed the trigger, and the cannon answered, a metronome of defiance against the storm. The pattern repeated breath, trigger, climb. With every pass, she became more machine than pilot, her restraint shaping chaos into order. The convoy reformed behind her shield. Soldiers leaned from windows, firing upward with rifles, no longer panicked but coordinated. The voice of a platoon leader broke through radio haze, steady for the first time, directing vehicles to push forward under her cover. Her strikes gave them the rhythm they had lost, her silence restoring cohesion where words had failed. Dust clouds swirled as the column crawled out of the killing zone. Morgan rolled for another pass, HUD flashing warning she could no longer ignore. Yet she tightened her grip and lined the reticle again. Brass poured into the desert air, shells scattering like rain across stone. She pulled up through the smoke, calm as ever, while the world below shifted back toward survival. The ridgelines quieted at last. Scattered fire crackled, but no longer pinned the convoy. Trucks moved in formation again, wounded loaded, Drivers pressing ahead. Morgan's breathing slowed, sinking with the glide of her climb, her gloves damp against the stick yet unwavering. She had defied every constraint, every order, and still her calm had held. The essence of leadership lay not in shouted commands or bravado over radios, but in the space she had carved between chaos and silence. Alone in the sky, unseen but felt, Morgan had drawn order from fire. Her response was never loud. It was steady, measured, and absolute. The warning tone shrieked across Morgan Hale's cockpit, sharp and merciless, as a white trail cut upward from the canyon floor. A hidden launcher had waited for her moment of descent, a man-pad streaking skyward like a spear. Her body reacted before thought, stick jammed forward, throttle shoved, the A-10 rolling low against canyon walls that blurred into rushing stone. The missile arced wide, then detonated in a bloom of fire that shook dust from the cliffs. Her heart did not race. Her breathing stayed measured, every motion exact, calm at the edge of disaster. The convoy below scattered, trucks weaving to find cover as the echoes of the explosion rang across the pass. Through the chaos she held her arc, dropping altitude until jagged walls loomed so close she could feel their shadow over the canopy. The warning light still pulsed red, a constant reminder of how thin her margin had become. She ignored them. Ahead, her reticle tracked the ridge where the smoke trail had begun. She steadied, thumb pressed firm, and the GAU-8 cannon unleashed. The sky split open with the roar, fire tearing across stone as brass streamed behind her like burning rain. The ridge erupted in a fireball, fragments scattering downslope. The launcher vanished in dust and flame. The silence that followed was not real. Silence, it was filled with convoys grinding gears, men shouting, rocks tumbling, but it felt like a pause carved by her will alone. Command cut through that pause with brutal clarity. Return to base. Repeat. Return to base. Immediately. The order came again, as cold as the first, detached from the firestorm she faced. She pressed the mic switch once, then released it without speaking. Her silence heavier than argument. She banked back, lining up for another pass, fuel gauge now bleeding into warning red. Below, medics scrambled through smoke to pull wounded into the backs of trucks. Engines strained, gears grinding as they fought to push forward through the kill zone. Machine gun fire still sparked from pockets in the ridges, desperate volleys that raked the canyon. Morgan rolled into them. Cannon bursts, shattering stone, suppressing every flash of defiance. Her engines groaned, exhaust pouring black smoke as she forced the aircraft harder than it wanted to go. Each second carried risk she could measure in fuel pounds. Each dive cut the number closer to zero. But the convoy moved. She saw them push trucks past the burning wreck, wounded lifted high in shaking arms, wheels churning dust as the column crawled toward daylight beyond the pass. Her own resolve hardened as her gauges dimmed. She pressed for one last run. The ridgeline ahead glowed faint from returning fire. She lined the reticle, her gloved hand gripping the stick with steady calm, her breathing slow enough to feel each rise of chest against harness. She pressed the trigger. The cannon answered. A final surge of fire that chewed through the ridge, collapsing emplacements into silence. The last echoes rolled outward as she pulled up, engines coughing under strain, but still alive. The convoy cleared the mouth of the canyon. Smoke rose behind them, fire still clawing skyward, but they moved free. Morgan circled once more, her own jet trembling, warning lights flaring, and only then allowed her eyes to flicker across fuel that was nearly gone. Resolve was not in returning. Resolve was in staying, in refusing to leave until survival was certain. The canyon finally released its grip on the convoy, trucks breaking into open desert where the sky widened and the ridgelines fell away. Smoke still rose behind them, a dark scar against fading light, but forward momentum carried them clear. Over the net came a fractured transmission, static, tearing at words but meaning still sharp. The last truck in line called out thanks, a raw note of relief and survival carried in the strain of the driver's voice. Morgan Hale listened in silence. Her thumb brushed the mic switch once, but she let it fall away. No reply. Her answer was only the steady presence overhead. Her fuel gauges glowed angry red, the digits dwindling with each second. Engines coughed faintly, a shudder passing through the frame like a weary breath. She banked gently, the movement deliberate, pulling her nose toward the long vector home. Below her, the convoy diminished into dust trails, small and fading against the vast floor of desert. For the first time since the ambush began, no new fire rose to meet them. Inside the cockpit, the alarms softened, dim chimes rather than shrill screams, as though the machine itself knew the worst had passed. The folded checklist pressed against her sleeve pocket, edges worn and oil-smudged, a weight both real and symbolic. She touched it once with her glove, anchoring herself to its familiarity. Through exhaustion, she remained calm, posture straight, every gesture steady, though her body ached with strain. The horizon stretched endless ahead, sun bleeding its last light into amber haze. Her breathing filled the helmet, unbroken rhythm against the fading hum of engines. In the silence after storm, there was no cheer, no applause, only the certainty of endurance. Recognition would never come. But she carried what mattered: knowledge that enough had been done, that lives had moved forward because she stayed. With that, she held her course toward home, one calm figure against the emptiness of sky. The wheels touched down with a shudder, brakes squealing as Morgan Hale guided the jet across the runway. The engines coughed, exhaling smoke before winding down into silence. She rolled to a halt at the far edge of the tarmac, canopy reflecting the low amber of baselights. Ground crews gathered loosely nearby, their expressions caught between curiosity and restraint. No cheer, no salute, only quiet eyes watching a machine return on fumes. Inside operations, a clerk typed a line into the mission log, the entry labeled support provided by unidentified air asset, no call sign, no mention of her name. The digital record already folded her effort into silence. Behind the glass of the control room, officers turned away, voices low, shifting quickly toward other flights due to launch. Her peers moved along the line, helmets under arms, offering no glance her way. Brendan walked past in silence, swagger gone, but not a word spoken. Morgan powered down systems with the same deliberate order she had begun with. Switches clicked, screens dimmed, until only the faint glow of caution lights remained. She pulled her gloves free, laying them across the seat, then opened the canopy. Cool air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of burned fuel and dust. She climbed down without hesitation, boots striking the pavement softly. A mechanic approached, wiping hands on a rag, eyes tracing the scarred fuselage. He said nothing, only crouched to check the undercarriage. His gaze lingered on her sleeve when she adjusted her harness. The corner of a laminated checklist protruded slightly, oil smudged, worn from use. For a moment his eyes held on it, recognizing what others ignored, the small proof of method and presence that had carried her through the storm. He looked up once, nodded faintly, then returned to his work. The crowd thinned. Engines elsewhere roared to life, filling silence with new noise. Morgan walked across the tarmac alone, her folded checklist pressing against her arm with each step. The system might erase her name, but truth lived in those overlooked details. Carried forward in silence, no record could erase. The mess hall was nearly empty when Morgan Hale sat down with her tray. Metal utensils clattered faintly against plates in distant corners, the sound swallowed by the heavy quiet of desert night pressing against thin windows. She ate slowly, each movement deliberate, posture upright despite exhaustion sinking into her shoulders. Around her, muted voices carried from small groups of airmen trading stories, laughter rising then fading. None of it directed her way. No one turned to notice. The window pane rattled once with a cold gust, desert wind slipping through seams. Morgan glanced toward it briefly, then lowered her gaze back to her meal. A coffee cup sat untouched beside her tray. Steam long since gone, its surface still as glass. On her sleeve, the faint bulge of the laminated checklist remained. Corners folded, oil-smudged proof tucked quietly where no one cared to look. She did not need their recognition. She knew the ridge had fallen silent under her fire, that the convoy had cleared the pass, that the lives below had continued because she remained when others withdrew. Legacy lived in that certainty, not in medals or speeches. She finished her meal in silence,